This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. As well as having a range of titles on the website, the series is currently commissioning further works. So if you're currently working on a book about animal studies, whether that's a monograph or an edited collection or something else, do consider getting in touch with the press or the editors of the series to see if it would be a good fit. And also a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Today I'm very pleased to introduce you to Professor Letitia Meynell of the Department of Philosophy and the Gender and Women's Studies programme at Dalhousie University in Canada. Her work addresses the philosophy of science, epistemology and feminist philosophy, which all feed into questions about our relationships with animals. Scholars of animal studies might know her as one of the co-authors of the 2019 Routledge book Chimpanzee Rights, the Philosopher's Brief, and she's involved in several other projects which are of interest to animal studies scholars that no doubt we'll talk about a little bit later on. Today, however, we're going to focus on her 2021 paper Gendering Animals, co-authored with Andrew Lopez, which was published in the journal Synthese. Welcome to the podcast, Letitia.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic of gender and animals?
Sure. I'd been doing some work on evolutionary psychology, which is a notorious research program among both philosophers of biology and feminist philosophers for endless problems in terms of sexist assumptions and in terms of poor methodology. And in thinking about the evolution of human psychology, one of course thinks about the evolution of non-human psychology, right? There's continuity there. And the way that scientists theorize other animals and that relationship with the human. And so through doing that work on evolutionary psychology, I started thinking more about the question of gender as socially learned, culturally specific sex-typical behaviors and other animals. And it just struck me that it's weird that we don't think about the gender of other animals, right? It seems to be assumed to be a uniquely human trait. And of course, at that time, I was talking the 2010s, there's a lot of work on non-human animal cultures, right? So chimpanzee cultures, discussions of bird culture, whale culture. So Hal Whitehead, who's a whale researcher, has written a very important book on whale cultures. And I was sort of in conversation with him a little bit. And so I just thought, okay, so if there are socially learned, culturally specific, sex-typical traits in other animals and non-human animals, that is gender. Why does that seem like such a dangerous thought? Why does that seem so disruptive? Because it did seem disruptive. It seemed disruptive to me. And so that's how I started interrogating it. And it had the life of the paper was very long. I first presented a version of it, I think around 2012. And it was a sort of fellow traveler with me for many years until I had Andrew Lopez working with me as a research assistant. And I said, can you help me? and we got it done.
So in the first half of the paper, there's a lot of consideration of feminist theories of sex and gender and the relationship of these feminist and queer theories to a relatively conservative field, which is research into sex differences in the life sciences. And you suggest that actually, despite first appearances, those two fields are in agreement about the relationship between sex and gender to a certain extent. Could you explain that?
So the brain organization theory, which has had this huge shadow in sex difference research, basically collapses sex and gender by saying, really, it's all sex. So they explain human and non-human animal behaviors by saying, look, the Y chromosome versus 2X chromosomes in the fetal human. They're usually thinking about humans, but of course they extend this to other animals too. The Y chromosome sets off this hormonal cascade, which results in the virilization, not just of genitals, but also of the brain. And so that masculinized brain, in contrast to a feminized brain, means that you have all these sex-typical behaviors. And we may call them gender, but really the reason why men and women behave differently is because they are fundamentally biologically different. So they collapse sex and gender by saying, really, it's all sex. Now, at the same time, you have queer theorists who were saying, well, really, it's all gender, right? Sex is not really sure, there are genital differences, but when you get right down to it, it's all about performance. It's all about socially learned performance. And genital differences don't really matter much. They often don't even line up. A, there's not just two sexes. We know that. But B, what's really going on is gender. And of course, depending on your gender identity, you can change a whole bunch of your sexual morphology if you want to. So they kind of collapse it all into culture, into gender. And so in that way, because it's all cultural and very sort of, complex cultural, they rule out the possibility of other animals having genders at all, right? And so you get this kind of weird collapsing where gender can't matter for non-human animals, for the sort of queer theorists and for third-wave feminists, because sex doesn't really matter, it's all gender. And then the brain organization theorists say gender doesn't really matter, it's all sex. And so there's a sense in which the possibilities of non-human animal genders get evaporated by both approaches.
So you bring in a particular approach to sex and gender, which is the sexual configurations theory. So could you explain to us what that is and why you think that's going to be particularly helpful for thinking about the issue of gender in non-human animals?
Sure. I think sexual configurations theory is one of the most exciting ideas that has happened in both biology and in feminist theory for a while. The idea was developed by a feminist neuroendocrinologist called Sari Van Anders. And she was struck by the limitations of the way sex researchers measured sexual orientation, right? You've got the Kinsey scale and a few other measures like that, which have been used for years and years and years. But Van Anders points out that there's so many other aspects to our sexual configuration than just what you can see on the Kinsey scale. So she really separates out a number of different measures by which humans can vary. Now, she's focused on humans, but I think what's really cool about sexual configurations theory is it really lends itself to extension to all sexed animals, right? Sexual behavior. So what you have with sexual configurations theory is a separation of a bunch of different components. So first is one's own sex, right? What parts you have, what chromosomes you have. And then there's gender. What are the socially learned behaviors that you identify with? But because for actual human beings, sex and gender, very, very difficult to tease apart. How can you think about your own body and behavior in terms of what's biological versus what's cultural, of course, are all tied together. So she introduces a new term, gender sex, which identifies the ways in which those things are tied together. And then she says, okay, so we've got lots of different categories within each of these classes. We can start measuring which one you are, right, in interviews. She also has sex number preference, right? So how many sexual partners do you have? That's something that, is a kind of dangerous idea, at least in our particular society. Obviously, it's totally normalized in other societies, but it's also really a feature where you find a lot of diversity across other species, right? How many sexual partners a particular organism has, whether it changes partners year after year or is monogamous through a whole lifespan, whether it rears offspring. So she has this really interesting distinction between nurturance and eroticism, where, there's who do you love versus who do you have sex with, right? These are very different components of a sexual configuration. And again, fascinatingly, something that's going to help to see the diversity of sexual behaviors among non-human animals, just as it helps us see the diversity of sexual behaviors and sexual configurations among human animals. So for me, thinking about that theory and how it kind of opened up a capacity to see and measure sexual diversity was really fascinating, because it just lends itself to a species inclusive gaze. And I hope it gets taken up by people who study non-human animal behavior in all kinds of areas.
Do you think then that gender talk is useful for thinking about all non-human animals, or is it only some animals that have gender?
It's definitely going to be only some. So first of all, not all non-human animals have sexes, right? And because gender is by definition a sex-linked social behavior, if you don't have a sex, you can't have a gender. So that's the first thing. But secondly, it is socially learned, right? So you need to have some kind of culture in order to have the social learning that is going to ground gender expression. Now, of course, there may be lots of non-human animals that have social learning and sexes, but don't have genders, because they don't have any traits, any behavioral traits that are socially learned that are sex linked. So there has to be some type of sex linking of a socially learned behavior in order for it to count as gender. So we're going to have to look at those social animals with cultures and have an open question as to whether they do or whether they don't. I think what's really, really important here is that we not be anthropomorphic and not just assume that the kind of gender constructions we have in many human societies are the same as what we're going to see in non-human animals. So one of my favorite examples, which I don't think we talk about in the paper, is the hunting by female chimpanzees with sticks of bush babies. So there's this practice among some chimpanzees, not all. It seems to be a cultural practice because it seems to be socially learned. And what they do is they sharpen sticks and they find trees with hollows in them that have bush babies sleeping in them, and they spear the bush babies and eat them. Now that behavior has majority been observed in females and juveniles. So you've got a sex-linked, socially learned cultural behavior, but hunting with spears, that's what men are supposed to do, right? In our man the hunter theory of human evolution, which, let me just say, I got a lot of problems with that particular theory. But we certainly don't want to project our current gender norms onto other animals. We want to be able to see them for who they are. And what I think is exciting about sexual configurations theory is it gives us some guide for seeing And it does that with humans as well as non-humans. I like to think of it as a species-inclusive theory of sexual configuration or sexuality.
For a lot of humans, their gender identity is very important. It's very central to who they are. Do you think that gender matters for animals?
I think we're going to have to wait and see, and it's almost certainly going to be species-specific. So I suspect that there are socially learned behaviors that are sex-typical in, say, some whales that are extremely important to their identity and social cohesion and the way they live and how they can live well. But we can't beg the question. We're going to have to wait and see. And I think it's important that we not just assume that really it's sex, right? The way these, maybe sperm whales, females behave in a particular way. Don't just assume that it's chromosomally, hormonally, biologically driven, but see if it is perhaps culturally driven, culturally learned and expressed over generations that way. It fits with the larger questions about culture in other animals and how to measure, how to verify or confirm that a particular behavior is a cultural behavior and isn't simply genetically or biologically driven in some way.
So what do you think is the broader significance of gendering animals or animals' gender identity for our relationships with them?
The thing about gender is it's partly how we make others real to ourselves. So an earlier version of this paper was called Engendering Animals, because I was sort of playing with the idea of bringing into being. And when you see someone as gendered, that's part of seeing them as a person, right? It's a way of recognizing a certain kind of complexity of being, right? Now, I'm not sure that's a good reason, actually, but that's what our culture does. It's one of the reasons that pronouns are controversial, which is, if you think about it from a purely sort of abstract way, why anyone would find pronouns controversial is baffling. I mean, different languages do pronouns in all kinds of different ways, but it matters to us that we're not mispronounced because it, matters to us individually, because it matters to other people what pronouns they use to address us, because the way they treat us often has to do with the gender they identify us with. And so you have this kind of complex self-other relationship, which is mediated through gender. One of the ways we can see people doing this, and I always find it a little bit disturbing, but is the way people gender their companion animals, right? They'll often dress them up in cute things and they'll behave towards them in ways that are as if they had the human gender of their particular society, right? The sort of fur baby phenomenon. And that, I think, has to do with how we value other persons, how we see other beings in a gendered society like our own. So I think that one of the reasons, at least, that gendering animals is a kind of dangerous idea is because it threatens to change the way we think about those animals who have genders and forces us to re-see them. And that requires a lot of us. You sort of bring them into society in this weird way. Now, I'm not defending any of this. I think this is just how we operate in this particular society, which is so structured by gender.
I'm intrigued by what you say about the companion animal issue, because that's not something that really comes up in the paper, but I think it's quite a natural question that we might ask when reading and engaging with the kind of ideas that you're presenting here. Is the thought that there might be a problem in treating, say, a cat in a particular gendered way when that doesn't match the cat's own gender identity? Or is that to oversimplify?
So I'm not sure that cats do have a gender identity. I mean, that's a kind of separate question. They are social animals, but they're not as highly social as, say, dogs are. Now, dogs, it wouldn't surprise me at all if various canid species had what are gender identities. And again, what I mean there are socially learned sex-typical behaviors, right? And you can often see genders when you have an anomaly, someone who's a sort of gender traitor or outlaw because they're, say, a female wolf that's behaving like a male. Well, the only way that can make any sense is through a gender analysis, so far as I can see. So I think this is where, again, it's not like a cat or a dog is going to understand what we're doing as imposing on their gender, right? I think often when we have impositions, we being humans, on our own genders, we don't think of it that way. People don't tend to see how structured their lives are by gender as something imposed on them. They just live it. And I think that's going to be what happens with most other animals too, when it comes to imposing gender norms on them. I think the real question is the much bigger question about imposing human anything on other animals. I think there's a challenge for those of us who have companion animals to navigate how we can help them be their sort of authentic selves and thrive as the kinds of beings that they are in relationship with us. And that's the big question. I think, whether you're putting a little Batman cape on your dog or a little tutu on your dog, if the dog hates it, you shouldn't do it, right? And it says a lot more about you needing to do that than anything about the dog. It kind of shows that you don't care about how they want to be. Now, having said that, I've heard that some dogs absolutely love getting dressed up. So, you figure it out with your own companion animal, but attending to who they are and what they want.
And presumably attending to who they are and what they want might include some element of recognising their own gendered expression. It's just that gender expression is presumably going to be very, very different to the gender expression that you and I are used to in human communities.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, again, I think sexual configuration is probably more helpful because it's not just gender. It's about being a sexual being in the world, right? And how other animals have to navigate that when they share that world with humans. So, yeah, I think figuring out how to respect their sexual configuration. I mean, this is where forced breeding is sort of obviously problematic. You're denying the preferences of the animal that you're in charge of. That's deeply problematic. But having said that, I'm sure that there are certain types of breeding scenarios which actually support the flourishing, the internal sexual configuration and the lived preferences of your companion animal. But it's sort of attending to those things and not just imposing them, which I think is the tricky place. And I think that's what a dangerous thought, like the idea that other animals have genders, does, is it forces us to look and try to attend to who they are.
Yes, I want to pick up on that dangerous thought idea to finish with, because I think it's very fair to say that this is a topic that's going to attract some criticism, both from queer theorists or feminists who object to their work or their ideas being extended to animals, or from conservatives who see this as a new extreme for so-called gender ideology. So how have you found people responding to the paper? Has it been a positive response? Have you had critical comments?
So I think, like most academic papers, it sort of falls dead bone from the press and, don't have actually a lot of immediate feedback about it. I will say it is the one piece of academic writing I have ever got hate mail from, which was from someone who I just went to grad school with for a couple of years, who emailed me to inform me I was a fabulous fraud, where I thought, well, of course I'm fabulous, but it's, I obviously I didn't respond, but I was curious as to what part of the paper is a problem. Like, honestly, I think that the logic of the paper is pretty sound. If there are non-human animal cultures, which means socially learned behaviors that can vary across different populations that are genetically very similar. So if there are animal cultures and those animal cultures have sex-linked socially learned behaviors, you just got gender. I don't see how that can be wrong. And so, maybe there are no non-human animal cultures. I don't know what definition of culture you're going to have to use to get that off the ground. But, you can try and attack that. Maybe empirically, there are no sex-linked, or rather sex-linked and sex-typical socially learned behaviors, right? That's an empirical question. Let's have a look. But if there are, and there's the cultural animals, you got gender. So I think the kind of underlying logic of the paper is pretty unassailable. And of course, as we point out at the end of the paper, there are lots of cultures which are not going to find this a dangerous thought at all, right? It's really just in cultures in the European tradition that have this, huge gap between humans and other animals, that have a kind of great chain of being way of thinking, that require an anthropocentrism in our ethics, in our worldviews, in everything we do, really. It's only those traditions where this is going to seem like a dangerous thought at all.
Now, Letitia, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yeah, I guess so. I have to admit I was somewhat befuddled by them. So I'll do my best.
I think that's fair, and you're very welcome to interpret the questions as you see fit. And I think that's one of the joyous things about this conversation, is that people approach these questions in quite different ways. And that's unsurprising, given that we talk to people on this podcast from many different disciplinary and cultural backgrounds. So my first quick question, which you're welcome to interpret how you like, is, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So I feel like I probably can't. And yet, initially I thought, well, how about Rudyard Kipling's The Cat Who Walked by Himself? Of course, it's terribly sexist, but is, I think, and in part because I had a cat as a child, really helped me to think as non-human animals, as autonomous beings with their own set of decisions who are choosing how they live with us. And as a small child with a cat with claws, I certainly had many intense personal negotiations with my cat. I can remember the first piece of pro-animal scholarship that I taught, and that was Carol Adams from The Sexual Politics of Meat. I think it was the 3rd chapter, Masked Violence, Muted Voices. And so there she has a discussion, as I remember it, of the absent referent. And so the ways in which how we talk about, say, the food on our plate makes absent the fact that there was a being who had a real body and a real life, whose life has been taken away to be a meal in front of us. And so, yeah, that's the first piece of pro-animal scholarship that I taught in a feminism class.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That's a good question. I feel like even when I was writing on evolutionary psychology, The first paper I wrote on evolutionary psychology was called Evolutionary Psychology, Ethology, and Essentialism, because what they don't know can hurt us. And it was a drilling down into a piece of research that had been done on vervet monkeys about parent toy preferences, where they claimed to have found that vervet monkeys have gendered toy preferences. So boy monkeys prefer trucks and bowls, and girl monkeys prefer dolls and pots. Pots always stands out for me as an opportunity for nurturance. I'm pretty sure there are no vervet monkeys who are cooking in the jungle. Anyway, when I was writing that, I really got taken up by the alternative of ethology to contemporary evolutionary psychology, in part because ethology studies other animals in their natural habitats and sort of attends to them, tries to see them in their own terms, looks at who they are, and then tries to describe them so that we can understand them in their evolution. And that's such a different way of engaging in knowing other animals than sticking them in a lab and measuring how many seconds they sit by a doll or a book or a plush animal, which is what this study had done. So I see that as being a kind of stealth move. I think I wrote a blog that was about, I think it's called Which Lives Are You Pro?, which I wrote with Andrew Fenton. And it was about how pro-life advocates should probably also be vegan if they are going to try and be consistent about the lives they claim to value.
Another very dangerous question.
Yep.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
It's going to be Andrew Fenton. I mean, this is where, I guess, in the interest of full disclosure, Andrew's my partner. And so he's been working on non-human animal philosophy since he was writing his dissertation back in the late 1990s. And through that path, we both became vegan. And, you know, whenever I'm writing, I have Andrew in the back of my head, who I know is going to shout out when I'm anthropocentric in certain ways. And of course, philosophy is structured to be anthropocentric. So you're constantly navigating how to avoid that. Just as it's Eurocentric, just as it has tended to be androcentric, right? Really problematic, especially for a discipline that sort of claims to be objective and, you know, all about careful criticism and that kind of thing. But yeah, Andrew's work, I think particularly his attention to other animals, right? That you have to see things from their perspective and then respect their perspective, right? So trying to think, you know, his dissertation was on chimpanzee knowledge, and trying to define knowledge in such a way that it didn't just presuppose human knowledge is a kind of fascinating task, but it's kind of the fundamental task for all of it, right? How can we move from our situated position as the kind of species that we are to include other animals in the way we think about the world and how we think about things like knowledge and ethics and those big questions in philosophy.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I guess I would say stop eating them. I don't know if that's the... I mean, I guess that's everyone. And maybe, you know, perhaps not all animals. It may be that some animals it's fine to eat. It's important to remember how huge the taxon is. Obviously, we shouldn't be eating vertebrates. I mean, you know, let's just get vertebrates right out of there. But it's not clear to me that, say, jellyfish have the kind of capacities that should rule them out as things that we could eat. So that, I think, leads to a question that I do think, or an issue that academics in particular should do. The one thing they could do is just make sure that we stop clumping all non-human animals together, that we actually attend to and specify and reveal the particularity of different taxa, whether that's, mammals or particular species. I think too often we engage in sloppy thinking because we've just sort of taken this massive taxon and treated it as if it's morally all the same. And that's just ridiculous. I think it's related also to the great chain of being that still structures so much of our thought, both ontologically and ethically, this idea that sort of somehow humans are at the top and the mostest of everything. We have all cognitive capacities, we have all moral mattering, and everything else is just bits of less in various ways beneath us. And of course, that's evolutionarily ridiculous, right? It just doesn't make any sense. There's a huge diversity of organisms with very different capacities, some of which are very much like ours and some of which aren't. And we have to look and see what they are and then use our underlying value judgments that we use for humans to say, well, if they're relevantly similar, then they count too. So I think those two things that academics in particular could do: don't use great chain of being thinking, and don't clump all non-human animals together, as if that makes any sense.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Stop eating them. I think, again, more complicated than that. Jellyfish maybe should still be on the menu. And I don't want to say that authoritatively. I don't know anything about jellyfish behavior. Also, again, a very big taxon. We might be quite surprised how different species vary in that taxon, or we might not. I have no idea. What we do need to do is look carefully and not just assume that they are one way or another, right? We have to look and see. Because eating is such a expression of power and objectification, it actually ends up being a massive change, because those things who you cannot eat because it would be morally wrong to eat them already through that acquire a kind of status of mattering that is going to change pretty much everything else you do. It's crucial to a basic form of respect.
What are you working on next?
Well, the Gendering Animals paper is sort of just one part of sexual configurations, right? Really focuses on gender. And so I am hoping to extend it to sexual configuration more generally and make the case that this theory of Sari Van Anders should be applied to thinking about non-human sexual behavior much more generally. A species-inclusive account of behavior. So I want to make an account as to how that could work. Some of it will be easy, some of it may not be so easy. I'm not quite sure how it's going to go. So that is one thing I'm working on. I'm also working with some biologists on the Gaia hypothesis, which is basically the idea that in some robust, scientifically credible sense, the whole planet can be thought of as a single biological entity or an organism. And this has been very controversial, this idea. So I'm trying to understand why that's controversial and think about how it could be perhaps a transformative idea that helps us live on the planet somewhat better.
How can people find out more about your work?
That's a good question. Probably the easiest thing to do is just look me up on ResearchGate. The other thing is, if you spell my name right, you'll find me. It's a sufficiently unusual name that there's just the one of me so far as I know. And so I've got things like a Google Scholar page and stuff like that.
Well, thanks so much, Letitia, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook, and we're just at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do spread the word about Knowing Animals, and if you're teaching, please do include Knowing Animals on your reading list so that people can tune in to learn a little bit more about the papers they might be reading. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.